Welcome to Gold and Blue Tube's playoff poll, week number 3. But before I get into my poll, I wanted to look at what the playoff committee came up with. So going from 10 to number 1. For number 10, they have Minnesota. Number 9, Oklahoma. Number 8, Penn State. Number 7, Utah. Number 6, Oregon. Number 5, Alabama. Number 4, Georgia. Number 3, Clemson. Number 2, Ohio State. And number 1, LSU. So that is what the playoff committee came up with. Now, for this week, for the chaos meter, we kept it at moderate. It was very, very close to being set at extreme, but we kept it at moderate. A lot of things happened this past week, and we'll get into that. But before I get to my top 10, I wanted to talk about the 2 teams that I had to knock out. And the 2 teams that I knocked out, I hate to say it, they were the 2 Cinderella stories that we were all watching. So we knocked out Minnesota, who was previously ranked number 5. They had a big win against Penn State, but then they turned around and lost to Iowa. Now, that's what I was talking about. Iowa is a place where teams' dreams of a playoff spot go to die. Sure enough, Minnesota goes to Iowa, and now their playoff spot is on life support. The other team that I knocked out was Baylor. They were my number 9 team last week. They had wins over Iowa State, at Kansas State, at Oklahoma, and then the loss versus Oklahoma. The win at Oklahoma State, and then the loss versus Oklahoma last week. That was a crazy game. It looked like Baylor had that game won. It was a tale of 2 halves. They were up big at halftime, and then they didn't score a single point in the second half. So they went from crashing the playoffs to crashing and burning all in the same game. I don't think I've ever seen that happen, so I bumped them out. So let's get into the Gold and Blue Tube Top 10 Playoff Poll Week 3. Number 10, I pushed Michigan back into the number 10 spot. So last week they were non-ranked. They do have 2 losses. They have a win versus Iowa, and then that win versus Notre Dame, which Notre Dame is looking much, much better. So I've upgraded Notre Dame to a good win. They also have losses at Wisconsin and at Penn State. Now, Michigan's remaining schedule is still pretty decent at Indiana and versus Ohio State. Indiana is actually a decent win now, so if they can get a win in Indiana, that will help. And then, of course, the home game against Ohio State. Now, for Michigan, their points per game is 33. That's not good. However, their points against is 16.4. That's good enough for 11th in the nation. So their offense still needs some work, but they do have a pretty decent defense. Gold and Blue Tube number 9 this week, and this is a big one. This one affected the chaos meter. Alabama. Last week, they were number 6. They have a decent win against A&M, and then not a bad loss to LSU. It looked like they were going to get slapped right out of Tuscaloosa, but then they came back and made it a game. The reason I knocked them down to number 6 and it affected the chaos meter so much was because Tua is gone for the season. That is a big blow for Alabama, and they're already weak playoff chances, so I don't know now. I'll bump them down all the way down to number 9. Their remaining schedule is versus a bad Western Carolina and at a decent Auburn game. Their points per game is 46.8. That's good enough for 4th. And their points against is 17.5. That's good enough for 12th. So they're good offensively and defensively. But like I said, that Tua injury is that's a big deal. That's why I bumped them down to number 9. We're going to move on to number 8 in the Golden Blue Tube playoff poll for week number 3. Last week, I had them at number 7. This week, it's Utah at number 8. They still have those decent wins against Washington State, Arizona State, at Washington, and at USC. USC making a bit of a comeback. They're ranked again. Their remaining schedule is at a bad Arizona and versus a bad Colorado. Now, their points per game is 34.7. Not a great offense. But their points against is 11.3. That is good for 4th in the country. So their offense needs to catch up with their defense. And that's number 8 on my poll for this week. Number 7 for this week also affected the chaos meter. And for me, I have Oklahoma at number 7. Last week, I had them at number 10. They have decent wins against Iowa State, and then that good win last week that looked like was going to be a blowout loss against Baylor, and then, of course, a loss at Kansas State, which isn't terrible, but Kansas State got knocked out of the top 25. That right there. So the remaining schedule for Oklahoma is versus TCU and at a decent Oklahoma State team. So they'll probably get into the Big 12 championship and will probably face Baylor again. So that will be very interesting to watch how that unfolds. Now for Oklahoma, their points per game is 47. That's good enough for 3rd in the country. So they score points a lot. Points against, however, is 25.6. That's not very good. Not terrible, but still not good. So Oklahoma, number 7. For number 6, Penn State, making a comeback. Last week, I had them at number 8. This week, I have them at number 6. They have good wins against Pitt. Survived at Iowa. Good win against Michigan. Again, Indiana, I turned them into a decent win. They're looking, pretty decent. And then that loss at Minnesota. That's a top 10 loss, so didn't hurt them too bad. Now, their remaining schedule is at Ohio State, so if they can win that game, guess what? They'll be in the Big Ten championship. That is, if they can survive Rutgers. I don't see any problems there. So that game at Ohio State is looming large for Penn State. Their points per game is 36.8, which is 15th in the nation. Points against is 13.5, which is 7th in the nation. So Penn State is not explosive, super exciting, but they're better than people think. And the points per game and the points against show that they're pretty good offensive and defensively. It's just nothing pops out. So that's why I have Penn State at number 6. Now we get into the number 5 spot. Last week I had them at number 4, so that would be Oregon. They have decent wins against versus Washington State, at USC, versus Auburn, and their remaining schedule is at Arizona State versus Oregon State. And their points per game is 37.8, which is good enough for 14th. Points against, which surprised me, is 14.8. That's good for 10th in the country. So Oregon has a better defense than people realize. So Oregon has a chance if they can get into the Pac-12 championship with one loss against a one-loss Utah. Maybe they can sneak into the playoffs. We'll see. This brings me to the number 4 team in my poll this week. As you can see, I'm wearing a Georgia hat. I knocked them out of my rankings. I expected them to lose to Auburn, and they did not lose to Auburn. They didn't overwhelm Auburn. They survived Auburn. But that's still a good win. So, yes, for this week, Georgia is my number 4 team. Last week, they were not ranked. I kicked them out. And the reason I kicked them out was because they lost to South Carolina. However, now they have wins against Notre Dame, versus Florida, and at Auburn. And I upgraded that Notre Dame win because Notre Dame is looking much better after that huge loss to Michigan. So Georgia's remaining schedule is versus Texas A&M and at Georgia Tech. So they can get one more decent win in before the SEC championship game. Unless they lay an egg at Georgia Tech like they did against South Carolina. I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but the South Carolina thing already has happened. So we'll see. Here's their problem. Points per game. 32.4. You have to score more points to be competitive in the playoffs because there's going to be a lot of offense in the playoffs. Points against. 10.5. That's good enough to be number 2 in the nation, and that is what is winning ball games for Georgia. I know it's boring, I know it's slow, but apparently it's good enough to get the job done. So, well done, Georgia. I bumped you up to number 4. Wearing the hat, told you I was going to eat my crow. There you go. So, the number 3 team on my poll this week, no change. It's going to be Clemson. Clemson was 3 last week. Clemson is 3 this week. They're still undefeated. They still have a decent win versus Texas A&M. Rest of the schedule, not to brag about. It's not their fault, though. They didn't schedule it. So what can you do? Just beat everybody. And that's what they've done. They did survive the North Carolina, but they have gotten better and better. Trevor Lawrence does not look like the same quarterback as he did at the beginning of the season. He's looking better every week. His interceptions have gone way down, so that is a big improvement that we've seen. We've seen him grow. Remaining schedule for Clemson is at South Carolina. Now, South Carolina is bad, but they did sneak up on Georgia, and it is a rivalry game, and it is on the road. So, we'll see how that goes. Points per game. 45.9. That is 5th in the nation. Not really a surprise. Points against, 10.7. That's 3rd in the nation. That was a little bit of a surprise to me because Clemson is known for, scoring points all over the place, and they were replacing a lot on defense, but turns out defense has been pretty good this year as well. So I expect to see Clemson in the playoffs. Number 2 team stays the same, Ohio State. Still undefeated. Still have the good wins versus Cincinnati. Like I said, I upgraded the Indiana win because they're looking halfway decent. They're going to a bowl. So they have that win at Indiana, and then they have that good win versus Wisconsin. Now, the last 2 games in the schedule for Ohio State is really going to test them. First, they get Penn State at home, and then they have to go to Michigan, and Michigan is looking better and better. Remember, they recently crushed Notre Dame. So those 2 games will really, really test Ohio State. Now, for Ohio State, this is how dominant they have been. Points per game, 51.5. This team is averaging over 50 points a game. That blew me away. Number 1 in the nation. Points against, under 10 points, 9.8. Guess what? Number 1 in the nation on both those statistics. So yes, Ohio State, good, no, great, both on offense and defense. This team is going to be tough in the playoffs, but let's see how they do against Penn State and Michigan first. This brings me to the number 1 team for Week 3 in the Gold and Blue Tube playoff poll. Playoff poll. Last week, number 1. This week, number 1. LSU. They're still undefeated. They have wins against Florida, Auburn, at Alabama. Their resume looks great. Nothing to worry about, right? Not so sure. Now, their remaining schedule, I wouldn't say is anything to worry about. They have versus Arkansas and at A&M. Here's where it gets interesting. Points per game, 47.8. Very good. Good enough to be number 2 in the nation in that statistic, but the problem is their defense. Points against, 23.8. Now, that's not horrendous, bottom of the barrel type thing, but whenever the playoffs come, defense is going to have to be a little bit better than that. So the matchup that I think that would give LSU the biggest problem would be Ohio State. That offense is explosive, and they can go over the top anytime they want. Also, Clemson's offense is looking good. So either one of those two matchups would be good for LSU, but I think the most problematic one would be Ohio State. We'll see how it goes. But for this week, I have LSU at number 1 in my poll. That's all I got for y'all. I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and come back and see me, and I hope I see you next time on Gold and Blue Tube.